Okay, as we carry on in our studies of personal identity, we're turning now to Hume's view. Now, Hume is a skeptic about personal identity, and the reason he's a skeptic about personal identity over time is that he thinks we really don't have any idea of a self at all. He says this, look, premise one, if we had an impression of an enduring self, then we would have that impression without interruption through the course of our whole lives. Now, here's what he means by that. By impression, he means some kind of perception or consciousness or awareness of ourselves. Locke, I think, just kind of takes it for granted that we know ourselves to exist right now. Hume is saying, uh, well, maybe not. If we know ourselves to exist right now, then okay, we're continuing our discussion of personal identity, and we're looking now at David Hume's view. Hume is a skeptic about personal identity. That is, he doesn't think you are the same person right now as you were 10 minutes ago. He doesn't think anybody is. Let me explain his argument. First of all, he's going to use the terminology of impressions, and by an impression, he just means some kind of direct perception. All right, and he says, if we had an impression, that is, some kind of direct perception of an enduring self, then we would have that impression without interruption through the course of our whole lives, right? If I have a direct perception of myself, then I've got that perception for as long as I exist. I would always be perceiving myself. But here's what Hume says. We don't have any single impression throughout our whole lives. There's no perception that we are always having. He says our thoughts, our sense perceptions, our kind of internal introspective awarenesses change instant by instant. There isn't any single kind of input which you're always having. There's no thought or idea which you've always got. But that's what you'd have to have if you were always having a kind of an awareness of yourself. He says, therefore, we have no impression of ourselves at all. Let me come at this another way. Here's how he says it. He says, look, when you introspect, when you look inside yourself and examine the contents of your mind, what you find there are a whole bunch of different thoughts and memories, desires, emotions, wishes, sense perceptions. But you know what you don't ever find? He says, I never find a perception of myself. I've got perceptions of my thoughts, but I never find the thinker. It's like thoughts are like actors going across a stage all the time, but we actually have no idea of the stage that they're acting in. I have no perception of a self at all, he says. Well, he says, if I never even have a perception or an impression of something, then I don't even have an idea of it. See, according to Hume, ideas are just faint copies of perceptions that you've had, or maybe mix and match of different perceptions that you've had. But Hume says we've got no idea of a self at all because we've never had an impression of a self. There's nothing to copy this idea from. So what does that mean? We have no idea even of a self that endures throughout our whole lives. There is all that you are. You're not some one thing that has thoughts, he says. You're just a big bundle of thoughts, and those thoughts are changing with inconceivable rapidity, instant by instant. And so you have no personal identity through time. What do we have? A stream of perceptions. He says the self, if you want to talk about a self, there's nothing it could be except a bundle or a collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. So there's properly no simplicity in your mind at a time. There's no one simple thing that the mind could be. It's this bundle. Nor is there any identity uh, between your mind at different points in time. Um, there's nothing identical about your mind today as yesterday. It's a different bundle of perceptions. Furthermore, if you fall into a deep sleep and you don't have any thoughts, that means the stream of perceptions has totally dried up and you don't exist in any sense whatsoever. Now, some of you may think, you always dream when you sleep. You never have dreamless sleeps. Okay, whatever. That's fine. He disagrees. He says, if the stream of perception stops at death, that means you are annihilated. You no longer exist. There's no afterlife whatsoever if the stream of perceptions and thoughts dries up. So Hume is a total skeptic about personal identity, but he realizes that we all believe that we are identical with ourselves over time. He knows that you think you're the same person today as yesterday, and he knows that you think that, your friends are the same people as yesterday. In fact, he says this question of identity, it doesn't just apply to minds, it applies to any kind of physical objects you want to look at. And he says, when we make these identity ascriptions, it's a fiction. It's an error which we make. If we sit around and think carefully about it, we'll see that we don't have any personal identity, but we make this fiction all the time. And so he says, here's how it works. He says, in reality, an object is identical with itself when it remains invariable. That means unchanged and uninterrupted through a supposed variation of time. In fact, he says, as he's just pointed out, nothing remains unchanged through any stretch of time. So nothing really has identity. But what we do have is a tendency, a propensity, he says, to confuse and conflate perceptions that resemble each other. So, for example, you experience your memories and perceptions as resembling each other, and you feel like there's this connection between the thoughts you have now and the thoughts you had yesterday. And he says you just blur those all together. You have a psychological tendency to overlook their differences and run them together as if they're the same. And that's why we posit the fiction of some enduring soul or self or substance to which those various perceptions all belong. But it's an illusion. It's a fiction that your mind falls into all the time. He says we do the same thing with ships or buildings or vegetables or animals. Like, if I change the boards in a ship, it's a different ship now, but we still keep calling it the same ship. When your dog grows up from a puppy to a full-grown dog, you don't change its name. You think it's the same dog, even though everything about that dog's body has changed. And the same with other physical beings as well. Vegetables, buildings. You remodel your house and you don't change your address, even though it's a totally different house now, because the parts changed. It's a fiction your mind falls into all the time. So, right. When we talk about personal identity, and we're talking about it in this fictional way, he says, we're not talking about perceptions that we remember having, like Locke said. He says we're talking about perceptions that are causally connected with one another. In other words, the thoughts and perceptions that make up your stream of consciousness, they're causally connected with one another. I mean, one thought leads to another. And so we experience our stream of consciousness as one causally connected, river of thoughts. One leads to another. He says, yeah, you can talk about that as personal identity. That's fine. But that's a grammatical rather than a philosophical definition of it. Right? It's one thing to explore what we usually mean when we talk about personal identity. That's just about how we use the words. It's another thing to say, philosophically, are we really identical with ourselves? The answer to that is clearly no, we're not. So when you want to ask about this grammatical question, under which circumstances do people usually say, that they are the same person as they were yesterday? Under which circumstances do people usually say, that's the same house that I grew up in? Under which circumstances do people usually say things like, this is my dog, I've owned it since it was a puppy? That's an interesting linguistic question about how we use words. And there's no right answer about what constitutes yourself in that sense. There's just questions about what do we usually mean when we use the word self. He says, yeah, if we're talking about this fiction, you can use the word self or identity any way you want, as long as you keep in mind that in reality, we've got no such thing as personal identity, and we don't even have an idea of what we mean by the self. All right, that's old David Hume. He plays for keeps. Now, in light of Hume and Hume's critique, I want to go back to Van Inwagen for a second. Do you remember what Van Inwagen's theory was? Van Inwagen said, you know what? Organisms can change their parts, but still be the same organism. And that's a way that a physicalist could believe in personal identity, even though we recognize that we change our body parts all the time. Hume would deny that. Hume says, no, man, since organisms change their parts too, organisms are not identical through time. That's just a fiction that your mind projects on the dog or on the acorn or on, your own physicality. You think that, sure, I know that people talk as if it's the same acorn that grew up into this oak tree. It's the same puppy that grew up into the dog, the same baby that grew up into an adult. Yeah, they talk that way. But that's all a fiction. That's just the way they use the words. In reality, philosophically, strictly speaking, no organism is the same through change. It changed its parts, so it's not identical. It's just not. Now, that's his view. Next we're gonna look at Thomas Reid, who, don't worry, he does believe that you have a self and that endures through change. Back later.